We seem to be living in societies where basic liberal values like freedom of expression, freedom of speech seem to be under threat from right-wing elements and left-wing elements in politics. If we want to avoid some of the worst things that have happened with mass murder, mass extermination, horrible wars, then we need to be thinking about liberalism and the threats to it. If you don't have that, you end up with political assassinations, like we've seen recently, and worse still, you end up with open warfare.
So Mark, what is liberalism?
So I would say that liberalism is a philosophy and it's an approach to political economy, the relationship between politics and economics, that is concerned about protecting individual freedom. So the core sort of ethical value is that individuals have a kind of moral worth, they have value, and that value should be protected in various ways. Now, there are differences within what we could call the liberal tradition about where the threats to that freedom come from. So people who call themselves classical liberals or libertarians would see the biggest threat to that individual freedom coming from the state and its agencies. People who are in what's sometimes called the liberal egalitarian tradition, which is a bit closer to social democracy, also see threats coming from private forms of power. So the power of corporations, problems associated with inequalities of wealth and status, those sorts of things. But all of the traditions of liberalism are motivated by a desire to protect a sphere for the individual, which enables them to live their own lives in a free way and to experiment in various ways with that freedom.
And why do we care about this? Where did this idea of we need to protect these rights come from?
Well, many people would say that certainly in the Western world, in Europe, you can trace the origins of liberalism to the wars of religion that took place over centuries. So people were basically fighting each other on the grounds of who had the true religious faith within Christianity. And some people kind of, if you like, through the experience of having constant warfare, almost by accident, hit on the idea, well, why don't we try something like mutual toleration? Why don't we try, instead of trying to seize control and impose the one true religion, allow different interpretations of religious texts to coexist? So there's a famous piece by John Locke called The Letter on Toleration, which is setting out this kind of idea, that what you need to do is allow people to go their own way, to practice their own religion, and have a space where people can exercise that sort of freedom. And it's a way of reducing the temptation to go to war, to control the state. So ideas around separation of church and state, for example, are very central to liberalism. But this idea can be applied not just to religious differences, it can be applied to any difference about disagreements that people may have about an ethical course of life. So human beings, I think, from a liberal point of view, disagree. They disagree about what's good in the world, about what values to pursue. And we have to find a way, therefore, of allowing people who do disagree to coexist without that disagreement turning into a permanent state of war.
And do you see liberalism as a uniquely European idea? A lot of the times where I hear about liberalism, it's like it's come out of this trend of Judeo-Christian values. But as a history student, when I look at kind of other communities, I see examples of tolerance. And the most famous example is under the Ottomans, where you had Christians living under their own laws, Jewish people living under their own laws. So is liberalism uniquely European, or are the ideas of tolerance more broader and we can see in different cultures?
I don't think the ideas are uniquely European. So what I've described about religious toleration, there's a technical term which is sometimes used, which is called modus vivendi. And what that means is basically you just kind of agree to disagree and kind of rub along together, even though there are profound differences. Now, you can say that those kind of ideas about allowing different religious groups, even in, for example, a predominantly Islamic society like the Ottoman Empire, are a form of liberalism, or they've got strands of liberalism within it. I think where you can say that liberalism is a kind of European idea is the working out of a systematic philosophy of liberalism. So it's in Western Europe in particular, and latterly in the United States, where people sort of tried to systematize what the liberal ideas were. But the notion of individual freedom, of toleration, I think this is something that many people in other parts of the world have been motivated by. So you can look at aspects of East Asian traditions. There are aspects of Confucian thought or Buddhist thought, which arguably have got certain kinds of liberal themes within them. So I don't think anyone should ever claim that liberalism is a kind of uniquely European project. But I think you can make the argument that it's in Europe and America that it's been more systematically put forward in terms of a set of written principles that people have worked on.
Does it come out of the Judeo-Christian tradition that it's a famous right-wing talking point that these values we have can only really be appreciated by us because we come from this stock of Judeo-Christian people?
No, I don't think it does because, as I said, I mean, many of the threats, if you like, to individual freedom arose through internal conflicts within that tradition. Okay, so it was warring Christian factions who were constantly fighting. And you could say that liberalism emerged almost as a kind of accidental solution to that kind of problem. Now, there are certain strands in liberalism, arguably associated with John Locke, but some other thinkers as well, who might want to make claims that notions of natural rights, for example, which motivate some liberals, are informed by Judeo-Christian concepts that you don't see in other traditions. But the idea of toleration, respect of a private sphere, these sorts of things, I don't think they are uniquely European or Judeo-Christian.
And do you think those values are universal as well? They can be appreciated by everybody?
I think the search for freedom is universal, but I think how that is expressed differs quite significantly across societies.
I just want to focus on one thing, on why we should even defend these ideas.
Yeah.
So let's say somebody kind of is newly listening to this and they're kind of thinking, why are these liberal ideas so important for us to defend in a time of where they're being challenged by the left and by the right?
I think they are valuable. Well, I think that the two reasons they're valuable. One would be, from my personal point of view, an ethical argument, which is I do believe that there is something valuable about individuals having their own conscience, having their own beliefs, working out their own place in the world, their own understanding of the world, and being able to act in accordance with that. So that is the value of individual freedom, which I hold personally as a very significant one. Now, beyond that, and this is where you perhaps broaden it out, I think if you just look at historical experience, when we don't have these principles of toleration, when politics becomes like a kind of permanent war of all against all, to get control of the political apparatus, to impose a particular vision, you end up with warfare. Now, there could be some people who would say, well, actually, we value the kind of martial virtues. What's wrong with war? What's wrong with periodically having fights? But when you see the carnage that leads to, I think that's a pretty hard view to defend. So I want to say empirically, if we want to avoid some of the worst things that have happened in the last few centuries, with mass murder, mass extermination, horrible wars, then we need to be thinking about liberalism and the threats to it.
So how does liberalism look today? We've looked at it throughout history. What does that look like in the 21st century?
Well, I think there's a great tussle happening about whether liberalism has a future. So we've just been talking in these opening comments about toleration, or I've been saying that toleration has a big role to play in liberalism, but we seem to be living in societies in Europe, in the United States, and perhaps elsewhere, where basic liberal values like freedom of expression, freedom of speech, seem to be under threat. And they seem to be under threat from right-wing elements and left-wing elements in politics. So I think it's a very challenging time for liberalism. These basic values of how do we get along even though we disagree, which is what the fundamental kind of liberal question is.
So what's happened with liberalism in terms of today we find a lot of young people, they're quite disillusioned with the system. Like, we live in a liberal democracy, but people can't get on the housing ladder, people can't get jobs, or they're struggling with inflation. How has liberalism failed, and why has it failed in the 21st century?
Well, that is there are many levels to what you just asked me. That's a very difficult question. So I don't think it's actually helpful when you're thinking about all of those problems to talk about liberalism as if we live in what you could just call a liberal society. Clearly, there are liberal democratic elements to our society. And by liberal democracy, I would mean some combination of a market economy where you've got private property, with democratic political structures. But within what we call liberal democracies, not all of the policies that are implemented are necessarily liberal. So many of the debates that take place around economic policy, for example, are about how liberal should the economy be. Should we have a more sort of free market type model, or should we have a more heavily regulated market model, or even go towards models of kind of state control of the sort that were found in more socialist systems? So when you're thinking about the problems of liberalism, you've got to look at what are the policies that have been implemented. Now, from my own point of view, I would say, if you're looking at the reasons why people can't get on the housing ladder, for example, why housing is so expensive, it's precisely because we haven't had liberal economic policies. So in Britain, it is almost impossible. That's an exaggeration. It's not almost impossible. It's very difficult to build new housing. If you're a commercial housing developer and you put forward proposals for a new housing estate, there'll be massive opposition to it.
What, from the planning system or?
Well, from the system that enables people to oppose new housing development. So that is the town and country planning system in the UK. You have huge planning inquiries, and those inquiries are typically dominated by people who live in the area where the new development is proposed. So, the slang term that's used for this is NIMBYs. And they're not bad people. It's understandable why, if you live in an area with a nice view and someone proposes to build a new housing estate opposite where you live, you might oppose it. But the unintended consequence of always giving into that dynamic is that houses don't get built anywhere. We have a shortage of housing, and lots of people end up being completely priced out of the market. So that is a very serious problem. Now, the view I've put forward there is open to contestation. Okay, so not everybody will diagnose the problem of the housing market in the way I've just diagnosed it. But that's part of the conversation you have to have. And from a kind of liberal economic point of view, the problem is that regulation is strangling many of these markets and keeping people out in very negative ways.
Mark, on that point, so I agree that we're overregulated, especially in building houses. But one point is we do need some regulation that we can agree on when building houses. You don't want anybody to put a couple of bricks together and build a house that's going to fall and kill a family. And I think the second thing that's missing is the government's role in building houses. So in the post-war boom, where we had the most houses built ever in British history, it was councils, it was elected bodies taking an active role in that, in the funding and formation of kind of communities and towns. Is this excluding it? And in your view, would it be purely private companies and private house builders that would take this on?
Okay, so that's a complex question as well. So in the way the UK planning system works, it doesn't matter whether it's private housing or public housing, council housing, people will oppose it. Okay, local groups will oppose it, basically because they want to protect their local property values. Or if it's slightly more, slightly wider, sort of more public spirited view, they might just be generally concerned about the environment, not wanting to lose open space. But those kind of interests are often quite closely intertwined. So it doesn't matter what kind of housing you want to build. There are problems with building it in the UK. Now, your point about, well, can't public housing play a role in this? Yes, it did play a role in the post-war period. We did have quite a lot of council housing. But I don't think it's true to claim that you get the biggest amounts of housing being built when the state is playing a significant role. So if you look at the 1930s, the 1920s and 30s, which is when actually most of the UK's housing stock was built, this was a period when there was virtually no public housing and there was massive construction. In fact, the land use planning system that was introduced in 1947 was introduced precisely to curtail what was perceived to be excessive development. So there was a huge movement in the 1930s, and immediately after the war, from a group known as the Council for Protection of Rural England, which is actually quite a small group, but a very, very influential one, which campaigned for the town planning system against what was called ribbon development. And you still see that development today in the UK, or the historical legacy of it. So if you're in London and you go out on the A4 going out towards the M4, you see roads and they've got lines of houses all along the roads. Those were all built in the 1930s. And the argument was these houses are extending out into the countryside. We need to protect the countryside from urban sprawl. Now, there is a legitimate argument there. Okay, you don't want the whole of the countryside to be carpeted in urban sprawl. So that's not necessarily a bad argument. The question is whether that's gone too far. And I think it has. If you do surveys of people and you ask them how much of Britain is covered in housing or urban development, people will typically say it's something like 30 or 40%. The actual figure is 9%.
Do you not think it's fair, though, that people can have some say about what happens in their area? Like you said, if there's a massive development that blocks a view, all of a sudden someone's shade is kind of, the sun's blocked out. Is it not fair to give people some input in what's going on in their communities? How do you balance the two?
It absolutely is fair. And what I think you need to do is find a set of rules which enable both the interests of those people who currently live in the area to be taken into account and the interests of those people who might be priced out of the housing market if nothing ever gets built. So over 20 years ago now, it's actually I'm getting quite old, so it's 23 years ago, I wrote an academic paper on this, arguing for the creation of what I would call like a market in development rights. So what would happen would be, if I'm a commercial developer and I want to build houses, I go to you, the residents of a particular community, and say, if you do not oppose the development, we will pay you compensation. Okay, so what you're doing there is giving people a financial reason, okay, to think about accepting the development. Now, they can still say no. Okay, they can still say, no, we don't want your money. We want our view. But the point is, if they're given the opportunity to have a deal done, then they might actually consider it. In the system as it works now, it's an all or nothing situation. Either the developer wins and gets to build the new houses and the people lose their view, or the developer loses, the people keep their view, and the people who would benefit from the new housing don't get anything. What you need is to do some kind of deal between these different parties. And the system we have kind of blocks those sorts of deals from happening. So I've been very pleased to see especially in London, there's what's called a kind of NIMBY movement developing, which is thinking about these kind of schemes where people could do deals. And that is the kind of direction I think we need to move in if we're going to have more housing built.
I don't know where he's gone, but please like, subscribe and comment to The Whitelist and enjoy our discussion with Mark Pennington. So I see how the free market can apply to incentivize housing. What about more broader and critical issues like inequality? So we're seeing rising inequality, the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. It's leaving to people in despair, in poverty. How do these free market ideals help constrain like that and unfettered capitalism?
Well, we've just been talking about one. First of all, we don't live in unfettered capitalism. We've just been talking about the planning system. If we had unfettered capitalism, we wouldn't have such a system. Okay, so we've got a heavily regulated market in this case. And the argument I would want to make is the regulation is actually responsible for the inequality. Okay, so the big inequality there is between people who own property and they see its value go up multiple times and the people who don't own property. So just to give my own personal experience, I managed in my late 20s to be able to afford a flat in London just like by taking out 4 or 5 times my mortgage. In the 25 years since I bought that property, it has increased 5-fold in value. Now, I haven't done anything to the place. It's the scarcity value. So I'm on the property ladder, but there are now people coming up who cannot get onto it. That's an inequality. But the inequality is being cemented by the regulation that is preventing new housing being built. Now, that's not the only inequality that you have. You also have inequalities within the market itself. So the housing market in the UK or the development market is very heavily concentrated amongst a relatively small number of big corporations. The big corporations like the land use planning system because what they want is a model where they get permission to build their houses, but then the regulation kicks in to stop potential rival companies or new entrants building their houses. So it operates as a kind of cartel forcing situation. Now, you don't see that in other countries with less heavily regulated systems. So in Europe, for example, in many countries, you have a lot of self-build. People build their own houses. Very few people in the UK do that because it's too complex to work through the regulatory system. People often think that companies don't want regulation. That's actually not true. What they want is to be able to control the regulation, to limit entry into the markets that they operate in. And that's actually one of the strongest arguments for liberalisation, that it facilitates more competition, and more competition reduces the likelihood that you get these rigidities or inequalities getting built in.
So would this premise also agree with the idea of a minimum wage?
I'm personally skeptical of arguments about minimum wage. So what I would favour is a minimum income, which is something different. Okay, so that's to say, we might decide in a society that no one should fall below a certain level of income. No one should be so poor that they can't afford to eat or do whatever. Now, the way I would do that is by having something like a basic income guarantee, which is financed out of taxation. What I wouldn't do is try to fiddle with the price of labour. The minimum wage is about trying to fix the price of labour. Now, if you do that, you are going to block lots of opportunities for people. So you could have, for example, working class people who don't have a lot of capital, who want to start a business, but they wouldn't be able to afford to start the business if they had to pay the minimum wage. So if you want new sources of capital to accumulate, new people who don't currently own assets, you mustn't introduce rules and regulations that actually make it more expensive for them to participate in these sorts of markets. So you can address the inequality concern, I think, not through regulation, but through direct income redistribution. It's a much better way of doing it than introducing restrictions that actually block the opportunities that people might have to create businesses or do experiment with new kinds of models.
Has anyone tried this?
There are some attempts to introduce it. So there have been experiments, I think, in places like Finland with a minimum income guarantee. But we already have it in the UK to some extent. So we do have a social security system. You know, you have unemployment benefit, all those sorts of things. I'd probably be in favour of a system that simplifies that rolls all the benefits into one package to create this kind of minimum income. But in general, as someone who is liberal on economic matters, what I'm in favour of doing is, if you're concerned with inequality, then give those people who don't currently have the money, but then let them spend it how they want to. What I don't want, from my liberal point of view, is the state trying to control how people actually spend the resources. Now, that's actually one of the reasons I'm more sceptical of your idea about, well, why can't we have more council housing? Because council housing is about the state taking taxpayers' money and allocating it to a particular sector, like building houses. It's not allowing people themselves to decide where they're going to spend their resources. So, that would be my view on that.
You know, in this model you propose where there's no minimum wage, what would your immigration policy be? And the reason I ask is because people could just bring in loads of people, undercut the value of local labor. And that's a common argument, like you said, on the left wing against immigration. So,
well, I'm personally in favour of a liberal immigration policy. So not open borders. I don't think you can have completely open borders, but I would be in favour of what I would call porous borders. So you do want people coming into the society. And I think there are two reasons for that. I do believe the argument that it promotes economic dynamism. If you have people from different cultures, different experiences coming into the society. So that's one point. The second point, though, and this actually relates to your arguments about inequality. Why should we stop people from poorer countries coming to the UK to try to have a better standard of life? I think you could say, if you're concerned about fairness or inequality, it's unfair that people might be in situations that disadvantage them quite significantly. Why should we stop them from moving to a society where they want to offer goods and services to other people at a lower cost? Now, yes, that can cause problems for people who are on low incomes here by putting pressure down on wages. But we wouldn't say, would we, if foreign companies come into the UK, that puts pressure on the profits of incumbent businesses. It's the same kind of idea. So I'd want to maximize competition, and I actually see porous borders as being a form of that. Now, that's not a popular view at the moment.
Yeah.
But I
very
defend
unpopular.
It.
Very,
I
very
defend
unpopular.
it. I would defend that view.
Yeah. You know, the argument I always see on the right is that a lot of liberals, and especially libertarians, see people as quote unquote interchangeable economic units and interchangeable.
What does that
economic
mean?
cogs. In terms of, like, you can just bring in 100,000 people from one place to another place and expect things to work exactly the same. When in reality, people come, they bring their own culture, they bring their own values. That could even be seen as a threat to, let's say, the liberal system that you built, where if people come from an intolerant society and they've grown up in that culture, maybe they bring some of that with them, and that starts to proliferate as well. So how do you combat that?
So that's the reason why I favour porous borders, not open borders. So open borders would be literally, you have no immigration control at all. Okay, you allow anyone to come in. I'm not in favour of that really for pragmatic reasons. So I think there is a grain of truth in the arguments that you just mentioned that those people are using, which is that if you have sudden movements of huge numbers of people into a society that come from very different cultural backgrounds, it's not that they're incompatible. I don't like that language, but it's that initially it's going to cause conflict. And we've seen this in some parts of Europe. In Sweden, for example, there have been big tensions between different cultural groups where it's not that one is necessarily right or wrong, but if you've got very different cultural traditions, they're going to rub each other up the wrong way in certain situations. So you have to guard against that. But that's not an argument for saying people from different cultures shouldn't be allowed to mix. That's what I dislike about this kind of right-wing narrative, which is basically saying, I mean, even from your point of view, why should I, as someone who's someone born and bred in Britain, if you like, why should I be prohibited from interacting with people from different cultures, which is what immigration control ultimately prevents me from doing? So I think you have to find a balance between not having a sort of complete free-for-all and what the radical right are now proposing, which is a total stop on people coming into the country.
I just want to challenge that idea of importing people with intolerant ideas. Yeah. And I don't know what the data bears, but this is just from my anecdotal experience. Second generation immigrants tend to be as native as the native people. Like my parents came from Pakistan, your parents came from India. Whether they're intolerant societies, I'll leave somebody else to debate. But I'm a believer of democracy. I'm as British as Mark is over here. And if you import somebody from North Korea, their children are going to be as British as the next person. So, and again, I don't know what the data is, but all my friends who are from ethnic minority backgrounds are to me as much as part of British culture as like a white kind of person who's been here for 400 or 500 years. The second issue that
I think that's right. I mean, I totally agree with that. I don't disagree with that at all.
I don't have any more intolerant ideas than somebody whose ancestors have been here for 500 years. We both are believers in democracy. We're both British people. The second, the criticism I have on this idea of porous borders, it's kind of like the brain drain of just taking like the best people from another nation and not letting them develop. And I think a lot of the people who do migrate because of economic insecurity, a more global argument might be that the reason why they're doing this is because of kind of neoliberal economic policies that kind of disenfranchise the third world, and that you'd much prefer to build stronger economies in countries like Pakistan, India, where they can develop and they can, where they can develop and build the economies of their own communities, rather than importing the best doctors, the best surgeons, the best lawyers to London and kind of leaving those countries in despair.
Well, yes and no. So the problem I have with that argument is if you say people shouldn't be allowed to come to Britain or the United States because it's creating this sort of brain drain, what you're saying is the governments of those societies should be effectively immune from criticism. So if the reason people are leaving is because those governments are introducing bad policies, whatever kind, and you say, well, people won't be able to escape from them, what on earth reason would they have to ever reform? You've got a captive market by saying people are not allowed to escape. So I reject that argument. Now, you mentioned, might people be escaping from what you call neoliberal policies? I dispute that. So if it was true, why is it they're going to societies which an awful lot of people describe as neoliberal? People are going to the United States or going to Europe. If you looked at India, historically, so did you say your
my parents were born, but like my parents are from India? My mom's from India.
India is a very interesting case. So the rate of economic growth in India from the period of independence up to the early 1990s was very feeble. And during that period, the Indian model of economic development was basically Clement Attlee socialism. It was a British import, but it wasn't a sort of liberal capitalist model that India was pursuing. It was a heavily interventionist model where businesses couldn't set up without having some permission from various government agencies. It was a system often called the permit Raj, actually. Now, the massive improvement that has taken place in India in the last 30 or 40 years happened when there was a partial liberalization. That started with Rajiv Gandhi in the early 1990s, and it accelerated through the 2000s. So people aren't escaping from India in this case because there's been liberalization. The improvements in India have come about, I think, as a result of liberalization. The people in Venezuela who at the moment are trying to escape to the United States, they're not escaping from neoliberal policies. They're escaping from Maduro's socialism. And I could give you multiple other examples of where that has happened. So in fact, I can't think of a single case where people are escaping neoliberal economic policies.
I mischaracterize it. When I mean neoliberal policies, let's take an example of Iraq and Afghanistan. They were what described neoliberal governments, came in, destroyed the country, committed war, and those people were fleeing. Would that be a better example?
I don't think that had anything to do with neoliberalism. What that was, I was an opponent of the Iraq War. What that was a result of what actually people described as neoconservative ideas that came out of the United States, associated with George Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, but there was a whole movement in US conservatism which believed that, and it overlapped to some extent with a certain form of what is sometimes called liberal internationalism, that you could say Tony Blair was a part of, which is that you had to export liberal institutions to other parts of the world that didn't have them, especially in situations where there were societies that had what people might have called failed states. So Iraq would be considered to have been a failed state. And the idea was we have to go in there and sort these societies out, if necessary, through violent means, through like the war in Iraq. Now, there's nothing liberal about that, in my view. So liberalism is very skeptical of social engineering. The idea that some entity, some state entity, can tell people what are the right institutions to live in. So this kind of liberal imperialism kind of model is not actually, in my view, a liberal model. It's the antithesis of liberalism. I think the properly liberal approach to those questions is to say, we believe in liberalism in our societies, and we want to demonstrate the value of them simply by showcasing what they have to offer to the rest of the world. And you would hope that other people might copy those institutions and practices, but what you would never do is try to impose them on a society. Wherever that happens, it seems to end in disaster. And I think the Iraq War is an example of that. You can also look at what's happened in Libya, which was another example of it. There are multiple cases where people have gone in saying, we know what kind of government you should live under, that ends in terrible outcomes.
So you said that liberal societies should open up and show the rest of the world what they can do. But what if it actually turns out illiberal societies are more successful? So let's look at the landscape today. You look at Saudi Arabia, you look at the Gulf countries, they're investing so much into AI. You look at China and the millions of people they pulled out of poverty.
Yeah.
If we have this free market of ideas and these illiberal societies are actually more economically successful than liberal societies, where does that put us?
Okay, well, that's a difficult question. The first thing I'd say about that is if you take China, which I think is the most interesting case, China is successful today in part, not in whole, but in part because it has liberalized. Okay, so if you compare China today, the economic system it has is not the one it had under Mao Zedong. Okay, so they adopted a form of capitalism. China is a capitalist society with a communist dictatorship in charge of it. It's a very paradoxical model.
Do you mind if I just clarify one point? From what I understand about China, the government play a big role in
do.
state investment, which is antithetical to like liberal.
I'm not disputing that. So I'm not saying there's no state involvement. It's a form of state-managed capitalism. And it's gone through different phases, different iterations. So there've basically been 3 different models since the end of Mao Zedong. So you had quite a bottom-up phase between the late 1970s and 1989, the Tiananmen Square events, which was predominantly focused on rural areas. You then had the kind of phase of development where they focused on these kind of special economic zones, which were attracting a lot of foreign capital. And you've now got the age of Xi Jinping, which is much more centrally controlled and more statist, if you like. But even today, the model is not the Maoist model. Okay, it is still a capitalist model, even though it's a state-managed capitalist model. Now, that model clearly has some advantages. No one can deny the huge success that China has had. But China is still nowhere near as prosperous a society as the United States or Western Europe. And I think it's a very open question about whether that model can be sustained going forward. And one of the things that worries me is that in Western Europe and the United States, many people are increasingly want to copy the Chinese model. And my concern about that is that the kind of state intervention you have in China, which could have some beneficial properties, I'm not necessarily disputing that, tends to go hand in hand with a form of authoritarian rule, which is a threat to individual freedom. Now, if you value individual freedom, if you value the freedom, to use social media as you want to live your own life, not to be told all the time how you should be living your life, you've got to be skeptical of the Chinese model. You've got to be skeptical of the social credit regime, where the state is monitoring multiple aspects of what you do and grading your performance. Do we want to live in a society like that? I don't want to. Okay, and I would want to say that there is something valuable in liberalism that gives space to the individual to craft their own life, which is threatened by the Chinese type of society, whatever other advantages it may or may not have.
Just to summarize, you're arguing liberalism not because of the economic success that comes with it, which you could get under other forms of authoritarian government, but it's actually the rights to live our own life that's unique in liberalism, which is why you defend it. Because you could get economic success with an authoritarian model, with dictatorships, monarchy, but what's unique about liberalism is the way it lets us live our individual lives free of constraints and the government kind of running our lives for us.
Yes and no. So I think liberalism is valuable because of that ethical focus on individual freedom. Yeah, and I do value that very much. But it's not the case to say that any authoritarian regime can deliver the same economic outcomes. So if you look historically at Maoism, Soviet communism, what's happened in Venezuela, these kind of models, they do not deliver economic prosperity. How many more examples do we need of those kind of societies? They don't. The Chinese model is a more complicated case, because it has got zones of liberalism, if you like, with zones of authoritarian rule.
And as I say, Qatar.
Yeah. Any of the Gulf
well,
countries,
the Gulf states, again, I think are interesting examples. So they're all dependent on the international global economy. They are petrostates. So if you have a petrostate where you've got a very valuable commodity like oil, yes, you can develop. But it's going to be questionable about how those societies cope. For example, in a world where people are no longer using oil. If we move to a post-fossil fuel future, what will those societies do? Will they have economic models that can cope with that kind of change? If they maintain very top-down economic models, then I'd be very skeptical of whether they could do that. Yeah, now that's obviously that's a conjecture. I don't have proof that that will be the case. We'd have to see, but the experience is that very heavily top-down regimes do not cope well with adaptation to new circumstances.
And then one more sort of rebuttal I want to give is how liberal is America? So we're kind of, the way we're describing it is a dichotomy, America liberal and China authoritarian. But is America a liberal state? As in there's so much state capitalism going on with subsidies, with their help for certain industries. And even some may describe that America is a country run by corporations, and they've done so many foreign adventures, affairs in foreign countries based upon the ideas of companies. What credence do you give to that argument?
Quite a lot, actually. So I don't believe that America is a fully liberal society. There are many zones in America which have actually got aspects of almost like the Chinese model.
Yeah, I heard they buy loads of milk and turn it into government cheese. Have you heard this one?
So,
yeah, I know seed oils have got subsidies in terms of corn, soybean, all of that. So,
let me give you an example of it. So I think the best example is the US military industrial complex.
Yeah.
Now, the irony here is that some people who advocate something like the Chinese model, for example, like Mariana Mazzucato, who has this idea of the missionary state, she uses the US military industrial complex as an example of how, as she would see it, you can have successful state capitalism.
Can you explain that?
Well, so she claims that...
Sorry, I mean the military industrial complex, for those who don't know.
Yeah, so it's the idea that there's an alliance between large-scale defense contractors or procurement companies, these sorts of organizations, and the US state. Now, that formed during the Cold War period, when obviously there was an imperative to have a kind of military buildup, or at least there was within the logic of the Cold War. But it carried on beyond the Cold War. So these kind of companies have continued to have a kind of symbiotic relationship with government. It's not an open market. It's not a free market. It's a very closed model where you have select companies that basically do deals with the US federal government. Now, Mazzucato claims that model is actually responsible for the iPhone and all these various technologies that have come about. I actually think that's a very questionable claim for reasons that we might go into.
So they're responsible for the most successful consumer goods, that's what closed market.
That's what she claims. But the reason I'm using that as an example is that within the United States, there are islands of illiberalism. It's also true within Europe. So for years in Europe, we've had the Common Agricultural Policy. Britain's no longer part of that, but we still have agricultural protectionism in the UK. So so-called liberal societies have got many zones which are illiberal. I still think it's worth calling them liberal societies compared to someone like China, for example, because there's what I'd call the zone of liberalism is larger than it is in a society like China. So I think you've got to make those distinctions.
Mark, let's look ahead and fast forward a little bit. So at the moment, some of the trends that we see in liberal societies are a massive rise in populism. So we've got Farage over here, we've got Trump in America, we've got your party that formed Corbyn and Zara Sultan. I'm not sure what's happening there.
I don't think that exists
anymore. I'm not sure what's happened. I guess we'll see. But across the world, across liberal democracies and liberal societies, we're seeing populism both on the right wing and on the left wing. How big of a threat is this to these liberal values? And what do you think is going to happen next?
I think it's a huge threat. So if we go back to the beginning of the conversation, the way I defined how liberalism arose, which was in the context of these wars of religion and people kind of discovering the value of toleration, we almost seem to be going back to the wars of religion. It's not literally religions fighting each other, but it's almost like political tribes fighting each other and not allowing mutual toleration, not allowing for peaceful disagreement and coexistence. Instead, you've got a dynamic on both the left and on the right, which is about shutting down people who you disagree with. And you see this in multiple ways. You see it in the language that people use. So there's a demonization of people who have different ideas. And you also see it in the practices of government, if you like, that are happening. So I think that the kind of cancel culture movement, which people associate with, I don't like this term, but wokeism, which has been very influential in Europe and the US over the last sort of 10, 15 years, that is an illiberal movement. It's an intolerant movement. But equally, the reaction to it that we're seeing from Donald Trump in the US and the populist right movements now in Europe, they are equally illiberal. So you've got two sort of rival factions which are determined to impose their own view of cancel culture into the society. And this is antithetical to liberalism. Liberalism is about pluralism, it's about disagreement, and it's about recognizing the rights of other people to live even though we disagree with them, and finding a way to rub along. If you don't have that, you end up with political assassinations, like we've seen recently, and worse still, you end up with open warfare.
Mark, I just want to challenge, was the US and the UK ever liberal in the sense of freedom of speech? And I've read some of Noam Chomsky's work, especially Manufactured Consent, where you had this monopoly of newspapers and people who are obviously part of the media who could control the messaging. And he has some great examples of how kind of the media picked, honorary victims and silent victims. And now, because we've lost, or the elite or the government have lost that control, and now it's all up in social media, you're seeing more overt forms of trying to control freedom of expression. And Charlie Kirk, for his ills, did support freedom of speech, and whatever's he supported freedom of speech. He's been assassinated, and now Trump is using that to close down freedom of speech. And we saw the cancellation of Jimmy Kimmel, the cancellation of a bunch of other people who have said kind of not the best things. So do you think we ever had this freedom of speech where people can showcase their ideas however ugly they are, or do you think it's always kind of been silenced and now we're just seeing a more overt form of it?
So the kind of thing that Chomsky's talking about, have governments always tried to influence the way in which speech is practiced? Yes, they have. But there is a difference in degree about the extent to which people are trying to exercise control today compared to, I think, what was happening in the past. You didn't have attempts to control what is published in various outlets on the same scale, I don't believe, as you see today. Now, it's certainly the case that the social media environment, in one sense, has made freedom of speech easier. Okay, so podcasts like this, or all the kind
They're going to come for us next.
Well, they may well. All these kind of challenger outlets, they're zones of freedom that didn't previously exist when we used to just depend on the newspapers or the 10 o'clock news or something like that. So in that sense, there's more freedom than there used to be. But there are also many more attempts to close that freedom down. And it's not just being closed down by the government, okay, in the sense of direct commands from the state to say certain actors shouldn't be allowed to speak. It's actually happening within civil society. So actually people outside of the government trying to close down other actors who are also outside of the government. So
Can you give us some examples of this?
Well, I think during the pandemic, I think is a good example. Scientists were policing other scientists' speech. Okay, so there were when we had the lockdowns, there was actually a lot of disagreement within the scientific community about whether the lockdown response was the right response. But you had, during that period, scientists who were supporting the lockdowns actually trying to censor the opinions of people who were more skeptical of the lockdowns. And they didn't just do that to individuals, they even did it at a national level. So Sweden, whose own scientists were saying actually that the lockdown response was not the right response, was treated almost as a pariah state by scientists in the UK and in the US who supported the lockdown regime. Now, that's not government power as such. It's not that the state is closing down the speech. It's actually people's values, the way they see other people, and what they think are legitimate political tactics operating in civil society. We see this in lots of, I'm not going to get into the debate because it's so contentious, but the whole issue of transgenderism or trans rights, the way that the different positions on that debate have approached each other isn't exactly a model of toleration. Either side of that, the pro-trans rights people tried to shut down the gender critical people, but now you've got the gender critical people in some cases who are trying to close down people who are supporting transgender rights. This is not liberalism. This is not freedom, open expression, and mutual toleration. It's something else, and we should be very worried about it.
Where do you think this started? Because you said that, obviously, Akil, you mentioned Chomsky and the fact that governments have previously tried to influence things, but it seems like there's been like a shift in the last few decades. Like, where do you think the inflection point is of that, and what was the rationale?
I don't think there is a single inflection point, as you say. I think these ideas or the way that people are behaving, I think they've arisen through ideas that are in general circulation. And you can't pinpoint any one sort of event that generates this. But I think one very influential narrative is the narrative which some people associate with wokeism. And let me tell you what I think it is. So if you have a narrative which divides people into two groups, which is that there are oppressors, people who use oppressive language, and there are the oppressed, then you are bound to see the people who you think are, if you like, the oppressors as people who you shouldn't speak to. Okay? You're bound to have an attitude which means that we can't talk to these people. They're completely beyond the pale. And that is not conducive to having a situation where you have open discussion or open contestation. Now, that's not to say that many of the issues that the woke left, if you like, identified are not real issues. So there is racism, there's homophobia, there's transphobia, there's all sorts of things that are in society. The question is, if you're concerned about those phobias or those isms, how do you best address them? Now, I don't think you can address them effectively if you say that people who have a different point of view about these things are oppressors. Yeah. If you use that language, if you use that discourse, you're not inviting people to a conversation.
They're an enemy.
You're inviting them to a war.
Yeah.
And you shouldn't be then surprised if the reaction to it is the right-wing version of it, the right-wing cancel culture, which is what we're seeing now.
Yeah, with Charlie Kirk, I saw so many people on the left, at least, but calling him a fascist, calling him a Nazi, calling him all of this sort of stuff. So, like, there is an intolerant strain on the left, the same way there is on the right, that I think is only just starting to surface, isn't it? So,
and you know, I didn't agree with many of Charlie Kirk's ideas. In fact, most of them. So, I'm not sympathetic to religious conservatism. I'm very much in favour of LGBT rights, all of those sorts of things, which he was sceptical of. But you can't say in a liberal society that there's no place for conservative opinion. And there's something very strange on the left where, for example, you see people attacking religious conservatives in the United States as being intolerant, as being fascist. But they wouldn't dream of saying the same thing about people who are fundamentalist Islamists, who've got the same kind of value orientation, if not a more extreme form of it. There's something very odd about that. You know, at least be consistent in the conservatisms that you're attacking. Now, I actually don't think you should be attacking conservative values writ large. I think the dividing line should be, are people who are espousing conservatism, whether it's kind of Christian conservatism or Islamist conservatism, are they threatening violence against other people? If they're threatening violence, then to me, that's not acceptable. But if they're just expressing their beliefs, that they think that, for example, men and women are different, or they're skeptical about homosexuality, those views should be able to be expressed in a free society without the threat of cancellation or these other kinds of things. That's what mutual toleration requires. And people have lost sight of that.
Mark, we've spoken a lot about toleration, and I do think the assassination of Charlie Kirk is an inflection point on this, and the responses from the right and the left. And most left-wing commentators have had a good response in that they've said that they're against, the assassination of Charlie Kirk. They support freedom of speech. You've had some crazy people celebrate it, and those people should be like, I don't know, they should just be like put aside and told that this is clearly not a characterization of the left wing. I'm talking mainly about people like Mehdi Hasan, Ezra Klein, like the big left wing commentators. They have come out and supported freedom of speech and said that, look, Charlie Kirk, however much we disagree with his views, we agree with the right of him to say his views, and none of it deserved for him to be assassinated in a college campus. And for those who support his assassination, the question I have to ask to you is, what if that happens to you? Your views are somebody is going to dislike your views. They're antithetical to somebody's ideas. And what if we just started shooting everybody we disagreed with? We would get to a civil war point. What is the liberal response to the Charlie Kirk assassination? Is it more censorship? Is it us restricting freedom of speech? Or is it like how do we deal with this? Because Trump is clearly trying to do something. So what would the liberal response to Charlie Kirk be?
Well, it certainly shouldn't be more censorship. It certainly shouldn't be more censorship. So, I mean, I would defend the right of people to say horrible things about Charlie Kirk. And even those people who are, saying what I think are horrible,
like celebrating his death,
comments, I would defend their right to do that. I think other people should criticize them for it. They should call them out for that, but they shouldn't try to cancel those people, prevent them expressing their opinions, unless those opinions are being expressed in a way that it is itself inciting violence. So if it's an inducement to, have more murders of people like Charlie Kirk, then it needs to be stopped. Now, it's very hard to draw that line. It's a vague line. It's not always clear when it's being crossed, but there is a line. And we need to have a politics that is informed by the recognition that there's a line, even if it's hard to pin it down. So it is not, freedom of speech does not mean a complete free-for-all. Okay, there are rules that govern any kind of freedom. And you have to work that through. But it is certainly not those problems are not going to be addressed by censoring people. Because what we've got now is a war of censorship between different factions trying to censor each other. And what are we going to do? Just swing back and forth between which group is doing the censoring? No, we need to have a different way of thinking about these problems and a different way of speaking to each other, I think.
And Mark, what is your analysis of the state's current control or historic control through its surveillance and through the way it kind of monitors us through biodata and all sorts of things? What's the kind of liberal response to that?
Well, I think you have to ask why is the state wanting to engage in surveillance of various kinds? And I think you can't answer that question without understanding the kind of narratives that are dominant in today's societies. And I think there is an obsession in today's society with controlling on multiple dimensions patterns. Okay, so what do I mean by that? So people are concerned about, well, are people smoking too much, drinking too much, eating the wrong sorts of foods? They're concerned about various inequalities. Now, all of these sorts of narratives imply that there's something wrong in a society where we've got messiness, if you like. We've got too much of a certain inequality there, too much of people eating the wrong sorts of foods there. And the suggestion is that we need to correct for this. Okay, so we need to eliminate the inequality. We need to stop people from eating the wrong sorts of foods. Now, if you have this kind of view of society, that it can be managed in this way, surveillance is a natural kind of development from those kind of narratives. Because what you have to do is monitor what people are doing. You need to make sure they're not behaving in ways that don't upset the pattern that you want. So if you allow people freedom in any dimension of life, they will continually upset patterns. They'll continually do things that other people don't want them to do. So whatever your favored pattern is, okay, even if it's a well-motivated one, like I want to reduce inequality, for example, people will always act in ways that reintroduce a new form of inequality. If we go back to the earlier conversation, if you follow my solution to poverty, which is give people the money, okay, don't try and regulate their wages or prices, give people a basic income. The likelihood is people will spend that income in ways that will generate certain patterns that we don't like. Now, it's the belief that we need to control society to produce what the experts or what the politicians or even what we as citizens think are desirable patterns that leads to this surveillance. Because it's about wanting to control multiple aspects of people's lives. And that requires that they're watched, that they're monitored, whether it's on the social media posts, the foods they buy in the supermarket, what they do in their life. It requires monitoring and surveillance if you want your ideal pattern to be realized.
But what if your ideal pattern is an objective good? So let's take smoking for an example.
Yeah.
I was in Istanbul a few weeks ago, and I literally was in a restaurant, and I went to the waiter, and he was smoking a fag, pulled the fag out, blew the smoke in my face, and was like, "Would you like a coffee?" And to me, that was like disgusting. I saw kids around smoking. It's kind of, you've been to Turkey quite a lot. Everyone's just smoking there out in public. And I remember when I, kind of like a decade ago, I watched an advert. It was in the UK of somebody smoking at a bus stop, and their smoke kind of traveling and hitting a kid that was behind him. And that was so powerful to me, and I assume to everybody else in the UK. And we've had this anti-smoking messaging push from government, and it's created a better culture where people, smoking's kind of been vilified. People smoke in the back alleys. They're not smoking in restaurants and stuff. Isn't that a good thing? We want to live in a society without smoking. We can all come to an agreement, be like, this is a social ill. It's causing, side effects. It's leading to more deaths. It's, inhibiting children from developing fully because of the effects of smoking, secondhand smoke. It's a good thing. So why should we stop that?
I don't think it's objectively good. So let me explain why. So I don't like smoking. I actually hate it. So my father actually died from lung cancer because he was a heavy smoker.
Sorry to hear that.
It was many years ago. It was when I was 5, which is quite a long time ago now. So I don't like smoking, and I absolutely share the experience. When I was younger, and I actually did used to go to nightclubs or whatever. I hated it when you came out and you just stank of cigarette smoke. You may not remember what that experience was.
Now
actually
there's like a smoking corridor.
It was horrible. It was horrible. So I don't like smoking. The issue is, though, that some people do like smoking. Okay, now there are different attitudes to the risk associated with it. And I think the way we should approach the smoking question is people have got different preferences. Okay, some people like to smoke. They know what the risks are, but they're willing to take them because it gives them joy and pleasure. But smoking causes what economists would call externalities. So if I blow the smoke in your face, I'm affecting you. The way we have to work out that then is about how we can have an accommodation. Okay, so can we provide an area where people can smoke and people can be free of smoke? That's not what's happened in the UK. Okay, the approach has been about banning smoking in all public places. Okay, so it's not that you can go to a smoker's restaurant or a smoker's nightclub, but there are other venues where there is no smoking. We've gone for a blanket approach which says wherever you are, you cannot smoke in public. That is not a liberal approach. Okay? It's this kind of control mentality. And you can think of that almost related to the conversation we're having, although it sounds different, about freedom of speech. Okay, it's about being intolerant of, in this case, an unpopular minority of smokers. But this dynamic applies in many other areas. People are increasingly intolerant of people who have different preferences to them. And I think it's very worrying. We see it in the kind of censorious attitudes that many people in the environmental movement have about the things that people consume. Okay, now there are real environmental challenges. Yeah. So I'm not a kind of denier of environmental problems, but I think it's very worrying when you've got this kind of censoriousness about, everything you put in the supermarket trolley is going to be evaluated on whether or not somebody in the green movement thinks it's a sustainable good or not. This is a very kind of controlling dynamic that we see in many areas, and we've got to be very wary of it.
How do you balance all those things, though? Because a lot of people, like Akil would say, that actually smoking or like prohibiting smoking and like limiting smoking in society is objectively a good thing. It's like you have way less of those externalities there. And even just messaging, even messaging is going to like vilify smoking.
I don't think it is. I mean, frankly, why shouldn't some people be allowed to, live fast and die young? Why not? That's an attitude to risk. Some people want to take risks. Some people go rock climbing, which is a very risky activity. Some people do martial arts, which have got a lot of risk factor attached to them. Other people don't want to take those kind of risks. We need to have, in a liberal society, one that allows people to have different attitudes to risk. Now, it's difficult when those different attitudes clash. Okay, and that's where you've got to provide different spaces for people to do different things. And it's not always easy. I think the reason that smoking troubles me and why it illustrates a kind of broader illiberalism, if you like, is that the problem of the externality related to smoking is a relatively easy one to solve through this kind of toleration approach that I'm advocating for. Okay, so it's quite easy in the case of smoking to say you could have a no smoking restaurant, but you could also have other restaurants that allow smoking. And the different people who've got the different preferences could sort between them. That's not difficult to envisage.
But what about seatbelts? Like, would you if somebody wants to drive without a seatbelt? Would you mandate that?
That's a difficult case because you've got issues to do with insurance, which can sort of interfere with that. So that's a little bit more difficult. But smoking, I think, is quite straightforward. You just need zones where people who want to avoid smoke can be free of it. And you need zones where people who want to take the risks from smoking can take those risks. That's not what is happening in the UK. What we have is a target regime, which is a determination to get smoking down to a particular figure or statistic. And that is not compatible with a kind of a liberal approach, in my view.
But then how far can you extend that logic? Because I think most people think that doing meth is crazy, but some people love to do meth or some people love to do heroin.
I mean,
do we let them do that? Do we let them have spaces for that?
I'm in favour of very liberal
drug policy.
Drugs,
yes. Okay. Yeah. Even if that affects the commons, like the public space where you have people that are spaced out and...
Well, it's... Again, there are always some fine lines there. So if people, because they're on certain sorts of drugs, engage in violence against other people or various behaviors that are threatening to others, then you need to regulate that. So it can't be a complete free-for-all. But there is a difference there between looking at potential effects of what people might do on drugs in certain situations and the idea of taking drugs themselves. It's that, the example that people might give is the problem with kitchen knives that can be used to kill people. The kitchen knife itself isn't the problem. It's the fact that somebody's using it in a particular sort of way. Now, with drugs, it's a fine line. Are there certain drugs that just make people be violent so that they can't control themselves? You might need to control for that. But I don't think as a general rule, the fact that, people might be doing certain substances that put them in a state of mind that we may not feel comfortable with, that's a good enough reason to stop them from doing it.
Mark, this takes me to another discussion where it's like everything's up for sale. So everything can basically go down to like market economies and
Yeah.
they could buyers and sellers. And I remember watching a podcast of yours where you talk about kind of selling organs and kidneys. I was wondering if you could give an explanation of how you justify people being able to sell their kidneys on an open market. Won't it be that just poor people are exploited?
Well, it could be if you're in a situation where, for example, you don't have what I was speaking about before, which is like a basic income guarantee. But if you're at the level where no one needs to sell their kidney, okay, because they're too poor, why would you then want to stop people selling their kidneys? Bearing in mind that in the UK and in many other countries, actually, there's a chronic shortage of kidneys for people who need transplants. Okay, so we have a system in the UK which is a donor system where people can just give the kidney away, but that is sometimes risky to the person who gives the kidney to leave them with one kidney. Some people might want to be compensated for taking that risk by having a monetary payment. Why would you prohibit that? If people are not forced into it by poverty, why would you prohibit them from then selling their organ? I don't think you should. Now, I understand the concern that some people have, which is that we don't want to live in a society where, as they would see it, everything is bought and sold. Isn't there is there nothing that is sacred? Is there nothing that can avoid the cash nexus? And my view on that is there are things that I don't think can be bought and sold. But my views on what those things are might be different to yours. And a liberal society, therefore, should not be banning things like, for example, kidney sales.
Would you extend this to other organs that are like more vital, like a heart or an eye?
Well, I don't think someone could survive without a heart. So
yeah, so for example, if they were like, I want 50,000, I'll spend it for a year and I'll give up my heart, and they make that choice the same way they make the kidney one, would you allow that?
I mean, if people want to commit suicide, I'm not going to stop them from committing suicide. I think it's a very tricky ethical area. You know, we'd have to have you can have a whole philosophical discussion on the ethics of suicide, which I think giving your heart up would be, because if you haven't got a heart, as far as I know, you wouldn't be alive afterwards. That is not the same with kidneys. But in principle, yeah, if people want to do things with their bodies that some of us might find repulsive or bizarre or weird, I would not stop them from doing it. I wouldn't stop them from selling them. I mean, the interesting thing is, you know, if you can give your kidney away, if I can give you a kidney, why can't I also sell it?
Mark, is there anyone today that's protecting those liberal ideas that we've been speaking about for an hour? So freedom of speech, protection of the individual. Is there anyone today in the political sphere? Trump seems to not be doing it. Keir Starmer, the online safety bill. Who today can you look up to and be like, he's got my vote?
There's hardly anybody. I mean, it's really depressing. I look around and I can see hardly anybody who stands for liberalism. There are one or two politicians who I've got quite a lot of time for. So Steve Baker, who's a member of the Conservative Party, lost his seat at the last election. He has a very good view on kind of freedom of speech, cultural freedom, toleration, and he's also an economic liberal. But beyond him, I'm pushing to think of anybody. There are very few politicians who in this country would stand up for liberal individualism of the sort that I've been defending in this conversation.
And that's crazy, because 20 years ago, it was Francis Fukuyama, the end of history, liberal democracy has won. Yeah. And now it seems we're on the epoch of like a new history. Yeah. Where do you think this is all going to end up? Like, do you think in 10 years, there's going to be a realization that we've kind of lost ground, that we've like lost these liberal ideals? Or do you think we're just going to continue going into populism, into the erosion of rights?
I don't know. I mean, I think one of the interesting things is if you look at some of the people I'm most influenced by, and Hayek is one of them, their argument essentially is that liberalism was an historical accident. Okay, so even what I was talking about before about, you know, the wars of religion and how liberalism arose, it kind of happened as an accident. And when you have a kind of accidental social system that starts to then deteriorate, as it seems to be doing now, it's actually very hard to say whether or not it will come back. So something can be very fragile. It could last for a very long period. I mean, liberalism of a certain kind has lasted for a decent period of time, But once it starts to disintegrate, there's no automatic route back towards it. And I think that's one of the reasons that we should be very worried. I think the most likely direction that we seem to be going in the UK and Europe, and perhaps also in the United States, is a kind of combination of economic protectionism or economic illiberalism combined with a kind of social conservatism. And I think this is what you see with the Reform Party in the UK. You see it with some of the populist right movements in Europe. You certainly see it with the Trump Republican Party in the United States. The left is, on the one hand, also arguing for economic protectionism. Okay, so all of the, I mean, you guys, I don't know whether you're old enough to remember, but the whole anti-globalization movement was a left-wing movement. You know, the pages of The Guardian were full of
after the
articles
2008
attacking
financial
free
crisis.
trade. Absolutely. They were always attacking free trade. And they're now using very similar arguments to what the Reform Party people or the populist right.
Who's worse for liberalism? Is it the right, the alt-right, Trump, and kind of the Reform Party, or is it the left, the
I think
centrist?
in my view, they're equally bad.
They're both equally as bad.
Because the left wants to close down economic liberalism, and they also, as we were having the discussion earlier, they are illiberal when faced with conservative forces. They try to shut down conservative voices, and that, I think, is wrong. Okay, so that's why I think we need true liberalism. That's what I'm defending, but unfortunately there are very few others who are.
Mark, there's one thing we haven't discussed, which I think is a critical part of liberalism, and that's democracy. We spoke a lot about freedom of speech, protection of the individual, market. How important is democracy to liberalism?
I think democracy is very important to liberalism because it is a peaceful way of removing governments. Okay, so if you have an authoritarian regime, and the only way you're going to get rid of that government is through some kind of potentially violent overthrow. So democracy is useful in the sense of being a peaceful mechanism for the transfer of power between elites. What I think is crucial, however, is that you do not think democracy is a kind of cure-all to everything. And for democracy to be liberal democracy, it needs to be limited. Okay.
The rule of law?
There needs to be rule of law, and you cannot have a situation where whatever the majority says goes, because then you have no guardrails to protect minorities. And that's important for freedom, and it's also important actually for economic and cultural reasons, because if you look at most progress in societies, whether it's economic progress or cultural progress or progress in sciences, it comes from minorities doing things different from what the majority would prescribe. So successful entrepreneurs are not conventional people. They are people who disrupt the status quo. They do things that other people might think are crazy. And this is true in the creative arts, it's true in music, it's true in many spheres. So there has to be a protected area where minorities can experiment without requiring the permission of majorities. There have to be protections for minority groups that have got unpopular cultural values or preferences or what have you. So you can't just have majority rule over every aspect of life. You need democracy, you need majoritarianism to have peaceful transfer of power, but that democracy needs to be limited.
And you spoke about the tyranny of the majority, and it's been spoken a lot about in political theory. And today, when you see what Trump's doing to the other kind of like the courts and Congress and the separation of states, do you think that this will have like consequential effects? Because when the next president comes into power and he's eroded some of the separations of the different departments, they can just kind of take even more control?
Absolutely. I mean, it's like from his sort of point of view of or conservatives in the US who are supporting Trump, they are legitimizing the very things that they accuse the left of doing. And I think the left were doing those things. You know, the left were trying to, if you like, take over the institutions as well. The response to that isn't to do it yourself, to take them over. It's to put forward, I think, like, this is what the liberal way of dealing with this is, you know, which is to say, we don't want to try to control everything. We want to make sure there is space for contestation. Now, I think in the case of Trump, there are things that could be done. For example, in American universities, if universities are receiving government funds, it's not unreasonable for them to make sure that there is, for example, diversity of opinion in what goes on. But Trump is going way beyond that. He's intervening in private institutions like Harvard or some of the other Ivy League schools, telling them, in effect, what they should or should not be able to do. That's illiberal. And when the left comes back to power in the United States, as at some point they will, what's to stop them doing the same thing?
Yeah,
Nothing.
And I remember reading a study about executive orders by the president, and they've essentially expanded. And the original role of the president was to preside over Congress and preside over the Supreme Court. And essentially, like with FDR, then with like Obama, and it keeps going. Executive orders just keep increasing. The power of the president keeps increasing.
No, Trump is like an imperial presidency. He is like the supreme ruler, which is not what the U.S. president used to be like.
And the next president isn't going to limit his powers. He's just going to take whatever Trump's given him and try to expand it even more. And you just get into this effect where it just goes. And again, like we spoke before, do you see this like changing at all, or do you think it's just going to get even crazier?
I don't see it changing unless you have a real change in the way people are relating to each other. And this is a problem where, going back to the earlier conversation, if people are approaching each other as enemies, complete enemies, as opposed to competitors. There's a difference between sort of competing with someone and actually hating the other person. And we're in a space where people seem to kind of hate each other for having different views. As long as that carries on, we're not going to go anywhere that's productive.
Mark, just to give another side to this on people like hating the other side, let's say the other side's a right-wing side and they're giving like xenophobic or anti-immigrant like sympathies, and you are an immigrant, you are going to feel that they're coming for you.
Yes,
they are saying views that are like attacking the essence of who you are as a human. So you are going to see them as the enemy. Yeah. I think, I don't know, the way I see it, I have sympathies for people on the left or people who come from immigrant communities who see the other side as like evil or draconian because they're saying things like, for example, if you look at in America, there was like a congressperson who said like all Muslims are the enemies, or they'll say something like deport all Mexicans. If you're a Mexican, you're going to think this side wants to get rid of me. Like I'm literally in like, I don't know, a 1930s like fascist setting. And so I get why that reaction happens. And so how should those people react?
Well, I understand that as well. And don't get me wrong. So I think there are many people who use that sort of language who, I wouldn't hesitate to say, are bad people. I think they're intolerant people, and they're people I would want to challenge. The problem is, and this is why I'm ultimately an individualist, you shouldn't tar everybody with the same brush. And there could be people who express some of those kind of views, even some of the people who express them in not always a terribly nice way, who are misinformed, who don't know what kind of language to use, who don't understand some other people's experiences. And the only way you're going to be able to get them to appreciate the damage they might be doing to other people by using that kind of language is to have a conversation with them. You can't have a conversation with them if the minute you hear that, you decide they've got to be shut down, or decide that they should be the subjects of hate, basically. I understand the reason why, if someone said something horrible about me, the automatic response is to kind of punch back. Yeah. But at some level, we've got to stop that. And we've got to stop seeing people as members of these groups and actually see people as individuals that we can have a conversation with. We've all got cultural baggage. Okay, so we're not these isolated, atomized individuals. We've all got cultural baggage. We've all been shaped in various ways by cultures and narratives that we hear. But that doesn't mean that when we're engaging people, we should just treat people as members of groups. We should try to understand the reasons why that person holds the view that they have, and argue with them. That's all we have.
Mark, I just want to say thank you so much for joining the Whitelist podcast. I honestly had an amazing discussion.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for having me on the Whitelist. It's been a terrific experience. Open conversation. What more could you ask for? So please come and join the Whitelist.